If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what are your favorite folktales, myths, and freaky urban legends in your area? Mine has one that's sort of freaky if you're really gullible. People claim that in nearby woods there's a house containing a family of albino cannibals. I mean, like, people who are pasty white, with sharpened teeth, who supposedly eat any people who trespass on their property. Kids in the area claim to have driven up there and shined their headlights into the windows only to be chased away by some crazy pale people. Not sure what to make of it since it sounds kind of ridiculous, but I'm sure people out there have better stories. 2. I actually have another one that's probably more interesting than my first. Near me there is this place called the Pine Barrens, a hugely uncultivated tract of forest known famously for being the likely home of the Jersey Devil, which I'm surprised to see hasn't come up in any comments yet. Anyway, there are also some abandoned towns and military bases in there, and this is one story my friend's dad told me. Apparently he was once camping out in the Pine Barrens with a friend of his when they were woken up in the middle of the night by a hammering noise. The noise was consistent and just bothersome enough that they wanted to go out and take a look. As soon as they left the tent, the noises stopped. And when they came back in, the noises continued again. The next morning there was an article in the paper about cult activity in the Pine Barrens. Evidently they had been out late at night nailing animals to trees by their throats. People used to say there was a hermit in the woods near my house with a white beard that reaches his knees. I guess it wasn't an urban legend, because I met him while running this summer. Nice guy. Not so freaky anymore. Gravity Hill. I believe the story tells that a bus load of kids were killed by the hill. Either way, if you put your car in neutral at the bottom of the hill and wait, the car will start rolling to the top. I've also heard if you put baby powder on the hood, there will be handprints once the car is moved. Baby graves. There is a very small fenced-in area where the graves of some babies are. They died of some plague. An old man will shoot at you with his shotgun if you aren't careful. It's common for teens to go visit them after prom or during the summer on a whim. Finley ghost. A misfit girl fell off a cliff / was pushed off on prom night. If you throw rocks out on the river and call her names, look out across the water. You will see her coming straight towards you in her prom dress. The only one I can think of for my area are the skinwalkers, which is nuts because I've seen one, I think. I live in southern Utah, near the border to Arizona / Nevada. The skinwalkers are witches who have sold their souls to the devil and carried out unspeakable acts. Supposedly they have to rape their own mother and then murder her and drink her blood, in return for immortality and the ability to change forms at will, human to animal and back. Some people believe they can only be one animal, some believe they can be anything they want at the time. Usually you hear about them being Indians, Native American, not India Indians, and when you see them as humans they are generally not wearing many clothes, even in cold weather, and they're always alone. One common thing of no speculation is they are evil. I was out in a really small town in the Four Corners area of Utah on a trip with a friend to her grandparents' mini farm thing. We went out hiking the ATV trails one evening in the dunes on the outskirts of this town, still near her grandparents' house. It was getting dark and starting to snow a tiny bit. Southern Utah, so not real snow like most people know, just little flakes here and there, so we started heading back. We're using her cell phone as a flashlight to follow the trail, and as we're coming up over a hill my friend stops dead in her tracks, staring at something. I follow her gaze to see an Indian man, tan, long black hair, with no shirt on, which was odd because it was cold out, but the scary thing was his eyes. They glowed like a dog or cat's eyes do at night, that reflective thing. Also, he was growling at us. The way a dog does a low growl is a warning when another dog won't back off. We both just walked backwards away from him, leaving the trail, like dumbasses, and he gets down on the crouches down on the fucking ground and crawls down the hill like freaking Gollum or something. Of course, being 14-year-old girls, we start screaming and running up the hill like retards, totally creeped out, still off the trail, and just sprinted up and down these dunes until we could see the lights of her grandparents' house. We burst in that door half hysterical, telling her parents about the skinwalker, and of course they didn't believe us. We went to bed, moved the bed away from the window and as much in the closet as we could fit it, pinned a blanket over the window and freaked out talking about it all night. The next morning her grandpa was all tired and said he'd been up all night walking around outside the barn with a shotgun because a coyote was prowling around the property. He said it was really weird because it wasn't howling and could have easily gotten through the fence to the cows but was circling the house and the barn. He couldn't ever see it but heard it growling and just circling until the sun came up and he saw it walking out by the dunes. My friend and I to this day, we're 20 now, still believe it was the skinwalker coming to get us because we saw him. In my hometown, There was an old black woman who would cover her face with white powder or makeup so she was this ghostly white. Her name was the Pancake Lady or White Face, depending on where in town you lived. She's been around for as long as people can remember. People remember seeing her back when they were in high school in the 80s, with her being as old as she is now. There are multiple stories to why she paints her face, the most common one being that when she was young, her husband left her for a white woman. And she just snapped. She painted her face white because she wanted to be white. She always wore these clothes that made her look from the 50s. She rarely left her home, only coming out at night to get groceries. And it was terrifying when you'd see her. She never spoke, just stared. She had cinder blocks on her porch to trip kids who would try to knock on her door, not that she needed them. No one messed with her or bothered her. Rumor has it she once broke into someone's house and just left a dead squirrel in the freezer. Earlier this year though, she passed away. The newspaper had a big article on her, because no one really knew who she was. She had no family that they could find except for a distant cousin in a neighboring city. Sometimes, when you drive down Kirkwood, you can see a light on in that house, and when you look away, you might catch that white face staring through the windows. I moved around a lot as a kid, but the town I went to high school in had the somewhat dubious distinction of being one of the last towns in New England to have tried and executed a woman for witchcraft in the late 17th century. So this woman, Goody Bassett, became the local version of the Bloody Mary legend. If you called her name 3 times at midnight, she would supposedly show up and tear you to pieces. It's also lore that she was buried in an unmarked grave in the Colonial Cemetery, and if you find and sit by her grave at nightfall, she'll appear before you. The summer camp is right next to the Colonial Cemetery, so there was a lot of kids daring each other to find a marker they thought was hers and wait out the sunset. She also supposedly left nail marks in a boulder in town, where she was dragged from her home to the gallows by an angry mob. Yeah. Cool stuff, except for the whole "this actually happened to some poor woman" aspect of it. The Call of Cthulhu. I talked about it with my mother, and she, being an English teacher that focuses on literary analysis, and I came to the understanding that, while Cthulhu is a terrifying being, it isn't the visceral appearance that is what is meant to frighten us. What is scary about the Cthulhu mythos is the knowledge that we are bacteria clinging to a wet speck of mud suspended in eternal nothing. And knowing that there are things out there that are above the petty limits of our Euclidean perception of the universe, massive beings able to leap across the universe when the stars are right and need not stop for death, is a truly terrifying notion. I always find Japanese urban legends fascinating and horrifying. One of them is the Tek woman, who is a girl who fell under a train and got cut in half. Her ghost how moves by dragging her upper body with her claw-like hands. Every time she moves, she makes a tek sound. If she catches you, she'll take out a scythe and cut in half to become like her. There's another version of her called the Kasha Mareko. She was attacked and abused by men and got run over by a train, cutting her in half. Since then, her ghost wanders the world looking for her legs. She mostly appears in school bathrooms or your own bathroom in the middle of the night. When spotted, she'll ask you questions, and if you can't answer them, she'll tear off your legs. It's also said that 1 month after hearing the story of Kasha Mareko, she will appear to you in a month. There are many more, especially the slit-mouthed woman. The San Antonio Donkey Lady. If you live in San Antonio or the surrounding area, you've had this legend or some version of it. The gist of it is that in something like a basket weaver had her house burned down by some miscreant teenagers. Because of all the corn husks and basket weaving supplies she had, the place burned down tremendously fast before anyone could help. Her face, hands, and legs were burned in such a horrible fashion that when they healed, her hands and feet healed into hard masses, like hooves, and her face had drooped forward, almost like a donkey. Driving in the area where her home once was could guarantee you could hear screams, and many people would come back with dented cars after they left because something would start throwing rocks and branches at their car. I used to substitute teach. There was one school that had a lot of crazy rumors about it. What's creepy is that some really messed up stuff has happened at the school. A janitor killed himself in the 50s below the theater/library. There's an old bell tower that can't be accessed anymore because some years ago a girl hung herself in there. A lot of the kids have had some crazy stories about the library itself. They've heard about books falling off of shelves, and strange noises. Some theater kids say the theater professor hates being there alone. They say he once got chased by a green floating light. It didn't help that they put on a haunted maze through the basement of the library last year. It was freaky and it goes 3 levels. It's also pretty old, so that made it creepy. I lived beside the site of London's largest plague pit from the 1300s. Thousands of people were buried there, some possibly still alive. The stories all invoke hauntings in surrounding buildings, like a swanky hotel and a nice gastropub. The hotel staff claim the front doors will open when no one is there, the lift button will come on, the lift doors will open and it will go up to a certain floor. Doors open on floor, no one gets in, lift comes back down again and doors open. They also say you can hear the screams of the dead of a quiet night, but I contest that there are so many clubs nearby. What you're hearing is the effects of alcohol and MDMA. Smile. I've also lived here for 3 years and seen nothing scarier than drunks and riot police. It's pretty awesome, however, that whilst building out the railway line that goes through this area, the construction company have to dig east, not west, to avoid disturbing the plague pit site. Pit is also under a local school's playing field. Lucky kids. I used to live in Bakersfield, California. Apparently Bakersfield High School is haunted. It's about 120 years old. It once had a hospital on the grounds near where the quad now is. And they used to bury body parts near there. Also, there's an auditorium, Harvey Auditorium, and while they were building it a worker committed suicide by jumping off the top. Also, there's a story about a couple that used to ditch class every day and they were hit by a car and you can apparently see them kissing on top of the bleachers from time to time. Anyway, I used to skate and BHS has some really good skate spots, stairs and such, and me and my brothers have been in that auditorium a few times after hours and there's definitely some weird shit going on there. The legend of Frenchtown Road. It's a crock of bullshit. I think. Maybe. I mean there's evidence against it, but personal experience says fuck Frenchtown Road. What's the legend? Well, Frenchtown is a long road that has a small school and some nice subdivisions along the way. Unless you go too far. After the last subdivision there's a solid 5-minute drive through nothing. Just trees and road. That's creepy enough at 2 a.m., but it gets worse. Eventually you come to a trailer park, with one really big trailer surrounded by a bunch of smaller ones. One thing you don't want to come across is the families living in the small trailers having a bonfire outside of the big trailer, all wearing red robes. Yeah, fuck that at 2 a.m. But if you go even further the road ends at an abandoned railway overpass. Nothing. There's just a railway overpass and an empty road ending right below it. I'll say it again, fuck 2 a.m. You hear shit. Not just noises, but actual voices. Something is talking to you. It knows shit. It calls your name. You drive back home as fast as you fucking can. I won't investigate further myself, but they say the trailer park is home to a cult that worships that voice. They have killed before. I used to live closer, but I'm a few hours away from Stalkhaze. The cemetery is supposedly a gateway to hell and the devil appears there twice a year. Pretty scary stuff, right? Well, unfortunately it's just your average tiny Midwest village cemetery. I'm not really sure why the Dark Lord would choose to appear here of all places. I mean, the only terrifying thing about the place is how bored you might be if you spent more than a few minutes there. Here in southeast PA, we have Albino Bridge. Legend has it, a woman who lived out in this remote, heavily wooded area back in the early 1900s gave birth to a number of albino children. So, logically, she drowned them under a concrete bridge that spans this small little creek. So now if you park your car and turn your lights off, the ghosts of the children come out and surround your car. I also want to add that this bridge is in the middle of thick woods, in an area that is notorious for driving around on one-lane gravel roads and smoking pot. It seems stupid, but when you're high as fuck in the middle of nowhere, it's a lot more frightening. Monkey Woman Bridge in Smyrna, Tennessee. Some of the story is true and some of the story is obviously an urban legend. Version number 1, apparently, many years ago, a woman lost her child in a house fire near the bridge. In her grief, she became depressed and spent most of her time under the bridge, crying. Late at night, you could supposedly hear her screaming, and if you drove too slow, she would reach up and scratch your car from beneath. Version number 2, take your date to Monkey Woman Bridge. Stop in the middle of the bridge, turn the car, lights, radio all off. Wait 2 to 3 minutes without making a sound. Turn your lights on and the old monkey woman, who lost her child in the house fire, would be standing in the front of the car looking at you through your windshield. My favorite was always Chunk of Meat, which is an American folktale, and the first time I heard it was from a storyteller who came to my summer camp one day in the late 80s. I also always thought the Paul Bunyan stories were awesome. They made me think about America when it was still frontier land and many people were farmers. In this tale, a little boy finds a chunk of meat outside when the family has no meat, and runs away from some eyes shining out of a log. He sneaks the meat into his mother's pot of beans on the fire, but while they enjoy their meal, a voice from the chimney asks for its chunk of meat. This is a jump tale with some dialogue similar to that of Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, ending with the black hairy booger up in the chimney saying it has such big teeth to eat you up. It also says it can stare through the boy, grabble his grave with big claws, and sweep his grave with a bushy tail. Courtesy of App. Lit. I wish I remembered it better, but it is in the book Grandfather Tales, American English Folk Tales by Richard Chase. One good story I remember hearing from Quebec is the Shasa Gallery. The loggers, Boucarons, would go up the river in birch bark canoes and they'd be away for months at a time. They were lonely and isolated, and by God they were horny. One New Year's Eve, a group of Boucarons were sitting in their camp, dreaming of home and of the girls they'd left behind. If only they could magically be back home for one night for the New Year's Eve party. Somebody, this guy named Lecoq, apparently, brought up the French-Canadian legend that people could make a deal with the devil to get where they needed to go. If they said the magic words, Satan would give their canoe the power of flight, and they could use this flying canoe, called a Shasa Gallery, to get back home and spend one night with their families and friends. There are always rules, though. They couldn't mention God's name, they couldn't wear a cross, they couldn't touch the steeples of any churches the canoe happened to fly by. They had to keep hands and feet inside the vehicle at all times. They had to be back by sunrise. If they broke any of the rules, the canoe would fly them straight to hell and their souls would be forfeit. The men were nervous, but they decided to take the chance. They got in the canoe and said the magic words and held on tight to see if it would work. Well, the devil delivered. He always does. They flew through the air, over the mountains and forests, and got to the New Year's Eve festivities in time to see all of their loved ones. As the night was winding down, they all piled back in the canoe, knowing they had to get back safely by sunrise to keep their souls. Unfortunately, Lecoq, the guy who had the idea in the first place, had gotten hammered as all fuck and couldn't drive the canoe properly. Nobody else knew how to steer a Shasa Gallery, so pretty soon they started twisting and turning, zigzagging dangerously. Going over a city, their drunk navigator narrowly missed hitting a church steeple, almost breaking the pact they made with the devil. The Boucarons were terrified. This canoe was literally possessed. They, or in some versions, only the really drunk guy, started swearing, "Oh holy Jesus Christ, mon Dieu, Calista Christ de Sacré Tabernacle." One of them, panicked, even made the sign of the cross. Luckily for them, though, before the canoe could fly them off to burn in hell, it happened to veer too far to one side. It hit the top of an especially tall pine tree and overturned, dumping them all into the deep snow. By some miracle, they managed to identify their surroundings and stumbled back into their camp just as the sun was coming up. They crept back into their beds and made a solemn pact never to tell the other loggers what they'd done that night. Alternate versions have the devil himself as navigator, trying to trick them into breaking the terms of their agreement. In some stories, they are condemned to fly the canoe through hell for eternity and they appear in the sky every New Year's Eve. My favorite would probably be the Chinese tale of the girl on the moon. Once upon a time, the Jade King, king of the heavenly courts, had 9 sons. They were the sun, and they were only allowed out one at a time. Unsatisfied with this arrangement, the sons escaped and played in the sky all at once. The earth dried up, wells turned into pits, and millions of people died. The Jade King sent down his greatest archer, who warned the sons to come down. The sons continued to play, and the archer aimed his bow, and shot them down, one by one, until there was only one left. The Jade King got very angry, and so he banned the archer and his wife from ever coming back to the heavenly courts, and stripped their godly status. The wife was very vain, and she did not want to age. The archer, who loved his wife more than anything else in the world, went traveling to get immortality medicine. When he got it, he came straight back with 2 packages, one for him and one for his wife, but his wife ate both, thinking the archer could just get more. She rose up and up and up onto the moon, leaving the archer forever stranded from his wife. So now the wife stays on the moon, with no one but a rabbit to help her make medicine from her garden as her own punishment for herself. I also like the story of the literal star-crossed lovers, a goddess and a mortal who fell in love with each other, but they're trapped on different sides of the Milky Way and only meet once a year. Sneakies. When I was a little kid, my mom and I would often go stay a few days at my aunt's house. There was a hole in the wall next to the spare bed where we would sleep, and my cousins told me that sneakies lived in there. Apparently sneakies were these white shadow little ghostly things that come out when you're sleeping, or maybe before if you take too long to go to sleep. One of them was supposedly good. I don't know about the others. But I truly thought they were real for years. When I have kids I'm going to make a hole somewhere and tell them sneakies live in there too. My hometown doesn't have a lot of urban legends, but the most known one that comes to mind is the story of Lydia, the girl under the Jamestown Bridge. Apparently, when the bridge was first built, there weren't any street lights around it. One autumn night, Lydia was walking home when she was hit by a car that was driving too fast and didn't see her crossing the street under the bridge. Now, people claim that late at night in autumn, if you drive under the bridge, you'll see a girl in a white dress looking for a ride. If you pick her up, she'll get in your car, give you her address, and ask you to take you home. About 5 minutes after you start driving, she disappears. A kid died in one of the dorm rooms on campus. Shit happens, not the first time or the last, but he was in a single and kind of a loner, so no one noticed for like 3 to 4 days. Died of something stupid, too, like oating on cough syrup, but it wasn't suicide. That much is all fact, you can pull the newspaper archives and see. But the legend is that the room is haunted. Apparently, when they got the room cleaned up and reassigned, the next student lived there about a week before demanding to be assigned somewhere else or returned to temp housing. And this continued for another few students, all moving out in very short order, to frats or friends or home or just somewhere else, until the CA said this is ridiculous, look, and grabbed a sleeping bag and crashed in the room for the night. Word is he bolted from the room at 3 a.m. and they bricked over the door the next day. Bryn Athen is a small town near my house. It's rumored to be a cult founded by an extremely wealthy family that practiced incest. The land is primarily owned by the Pitcairns, where their family has either inbred or married close relatives and stayed within the confines of Bryn Athen over centuries to present day for financial reasons. Within this highly inbred, political community is a Christian cult church known as the New Church, which spans globally and awards high-paying contracts, jobs and even careers to the political elite. They follow the Swedenborgian writings, a deciphering of God's word, though the prophet Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish scientist, philosopher, Christian mystic, and theologian. On top of this all, Bryn Athen is a tax-free borough. All of the schools within the borough are private, belonging to the New Church. So living within Bryn Athen is a tax loophole for the Philadelphia social elite. On the wooded area that is now used as a children's campground, there is the legend of Boxcar Willie, who was a homeless wanderer. One night while looking for shelter, he climbed into one of the boxcars along the train tracks. Through some hullabaloo he managed to get locked in, and they didn't find him for several days. He had clawed the walls trying to get out until his fingers were raw, fingernails and all, or something of the sort. But now at that campsite they like to drag all of the little kidlings out there, make them play in the boxcar, then sit them down and tell them the story. Not really an urban legend, but some very creepy things going on over the years. My entire family comes from a little German town called Rottenberg in der Fulda, infamously known as the hometown of Armand Mivas, the cannibal of Rottenberg, who found a volunteer who was willing to have his dick cut off so Armand could cook it and eat it. My dad went to school with the guy. So here comes the Mulder and Scully part. Mivas grew up in a little outside part of town, basically just 2 farms and 4 houses out in the surrounding mountains. And that little place had a history of breeding insane people long before Mivas. There was a self-alleged witch living in one of the houses who claimed to be able to kill people through the powers of her mind and had her own satanic cult going on, of which she was the priestess, and in the last few decades almost half of the kids being born up there had some kind of disability or defect when they were born, which half the town suspects is because of a lot of incest going on up there. A giant called Gwendol Reckonap Schenkenap Meinidmer with a grudge against the town of Shrewsbury decided to flood the town and kill all its inhabitants. So he collected a giant-sized spade full of earth and set off towards the town. When in the vicinity of Wellington he met a cobbler returning from Shrewsbury market with a large sackful of shoes for repair. The giant asked him for directions, adding that he was going to dump his spadeful of earth in the River Severn and flood the town. "It's a very long way to Shrewsbury," replied the quick-thinking shoemaker. "Look at all these shoes I've worn out walking back from there." The giant immediately decided to abandon his enterprise and dumped the earth on the ground beside him, where it became the wrecking. The giant also scraped the mud off his boots, which became the smaller hill Urquhart Hill nearby. The Ojibwe legend of how maple syrup came to be. A very long time ago, when the world was new, Gitche Manitou made things so that life was very easy for the people. There was plenty of game and the weather was always good, and the maple trees were filled with thick sweet syrup. Whenever anyone wanted to get maple syrup from the trees, all they had to do was break off a twig and collect it as it dripped out. One day, Manabasho went walking around. "I think I'll go see how my friends the Anishinaabe are doing," he said. So, he went to a village of Indian people. But, there was no one around. So, Manabasho looked for the people. They were not fishing in the streams or the lake. They were not working in the fields hoeing their crops. They were not gathering berries. Finally, he found them. They were in the grove of maple trees near the village. They were just lying on their backs with their mouths open, letting maple syrup drip into their mouths. "This will not do," Manabasho said. "My people are all going to be fat and lazy if they keep on living this way." So, Manabasho went down to the river. He took with him a big basket he had made of birch bark. With this basket, he brought back many buckets of water. He went to the top of the maple trees and poured water in, so that it thinned out the syrup. Now, thick maple syrup no longer dripped out of the broken twigs. Now what came out was thin and watery and just barely sweet to the taste. "This is how it will be from now on," Manabasho said. "No longer will syrup drip from the maple trees. Now there will only be this watery sap. When people want to make maple syrup, they will have to gather many buckets full of the sap in a birch bark basket like mine. They will have to gather wood and make fires so they can heat stones to drop into the baskets. They will have to boil the water with the heated stones for a long time to make even a little maple syrup. Then my people will no longer grow fat and lazy. Then they will appreciate this maple syrup Gitchi Manito made available to them. Not only that, this sap will drip only from the trees at a certain time of the year. Then it will not keep people from hunting and fishing and gathering and hoeing in the fields. This is how it is going to be," Manabasho said. And that is how it is to this day. I'm from Lexington, Kentucky, and my extended family is from the Knobs region in south-central Kentucky. When I'd spend summers down there, at night, they would always tell stories about the walking bear of Poor Town. It was supposed to be this 8.5-foot tall Bigfoot-like creature that absolutely hates the shit out of people. The legend goes that it murdered multiple families over the course of several weeks during the mid-1950s. Twisted their heads clean off, men, women, even the old folks and little kids. One night, the sheriff rounded up all the men, guns, and hunting dogs in town, and they were gonna track it down and shoot it. They followed its footprints in the wet, Kentucky clay to the same holler where it killed the families. They tracked it deep into the thick, dark, kudzu-covered woods, and suddenly, as if a switch was flipped, the cicadas, frogs, crickets, owls, and coyotes went completely silent. Something huge was crashing through the brush about 20 yards ahead. Then they started hearing these unbelievably loud, wild, guttural, otherworldly screams. Now remember, they had all of the hunting dogs in one small, rural, Kentucky town. So that's like 50 dogs, none of which are gun-shy. Upon hearing these sounds, the dogs hauled ass out of there with the owners right on their heels. The houses supposedly still stand to this day. Nobody's gone down that holler since. Well, except maybe moonshiners and weed growers, they be packing some heat. The tale of how Krakow was founded. There once was a small village along the Vistula River. Near this village, there was a hill. In the side of the hill, there was a cave. Nobody ever went into the cave, and the elders said that no one should go into the cave because the elders' fathers had once told tales of a dragon that slept in that cave. Unfortunately, a group of youths didn't believe in the myth. To end these stories, they decided to explore the cave and end these rumors and myths. They cleared the overgrown vines and weeds from the cave's entrance, and went in. However, they soon came to a dead end. Stopping to rest, the group realized that there was a warm wind coming from deeper in the cave while cold air from the entrance whistled past them regularly. They realized that they could hear heavy breathing and that one of the walls was made of scales. They ran out of the cave as fire licked at their heels. They looked back and watched as the dragon came out of the cave, enraged that it had been woken. From that day, there was no peace. The dragon would destroy buildings and eat sheep, or young virgins. Several people tried to kill the dragon, but failed. However, the shoemaker's apprentice, Krakow, had a clever idea. He made a thick, yellow paste out of sulfur and used it to paint the sheep. He then herded all the sheep to where the dragon would see them. The dragon ate them, and the sulfur made his stomach burn. He ran to the river and began drinking water. No matter how much he drank, the fire in his belly wouldn't stop. He drank so much, he blew up. In Krakow's honor, a fort was built on the Dragon's Hill. It was named after him, Krakow. A long time ago at the local high school, the gym teacher's son hung himself on the bleachers. His father was running the track early morning and found his body. I guess the kid was under a lot of pressure being on the football team and was going through some rough times with his girlfriend and snapped. But anyways, people say if you walk through the guy's locker room sometimes you can feel his presence, not sure what that means 0_O. Also his girlfriend at the time apparently vanished after the whole thing happened. I believe it happened in the late 80s. Some of the older teachers at the school would mention remembering it happening when asked about it, and one believes they saw the kid's ghost. Here goes my little urban legend. I grew up in a trailer park on the outskirts of a town in Washington state. It was a relatively nice park, had trees and yards and a little patch of forest behind it. When I was around 7, my friends and I had full reign of the neighborhood because it was essentially isolated. None of us were going to get out and cause trouble, so we'd just go outside, run around until it got dark, come in, then do it all again the next day. A good friend of mine started telling me about the aptly named Chainsaw Man who lived in the woods behind our park and would chase away any unsuspecting trespassers to his land with a chainsaw. Well, being that we lived in a rural area, there was always a lot of work going on in the forest, so kids would swear they could hear him out there killing people or whatever. I only kind of believed her. One day, we were walking home and she was talking to me about the Chainsaw Man and kids who had recently gone missing when our neighbor decides to start up his chainsaw to get rid of a stump in his yard 3 houses down. I ran faster than I ever had in my entire life. I believed in that damn Chainsaw Man until I was almost in high school too. Looking back, it's pretty funny, but at the time I swore some guy in a mask was going to rip me to pieces if I went in the woods behind my house. The Legend of the Ghost of La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. It's a New Mexican folktale. There once was a beautiful woman named Maria, who was more beautiful than all the other women in her village, and always thought that there was never a man good enough to suit her. She had been wooed by almost all the men in her village, and most men that came to the village traveling, but none were ever good enough. One day, a handsome, wealthy man came to the village while traveling and fell in love with Maria, and she had finally accepted this man as good enough to go out with, and they fell deeply in love. They had 3 children and lived in the city of Tos by the river. After 10 years passed, the man left Maria, abandoning their family, and leaving them very poor. Every day, Maria looked at her children, and reminded herself of her only love, and what he had brought upon her. She had lost her beauty with age and could probably never marry again, with her standards set so high. In a fit of rage, she took her children out to the river, grabbing their arms so hard that her fingernails dug into their skin and made them bleed, and threw them in. After doing this, she realized she had just murdered the only family and chance of happiness she had left, and chased after them. After a couple minutes of running down the river, she hit her head on a rock and died. They say in Tos, at night, you can still hear her screaming for her lost children near the river, but if her spirit see a child walking near the river after dark, she becomes enraged and throws them into the river. The purpose of the story is to try to keep the children from going out after dark. I like the Japanese spirit demon, Ashirai Yoshiki. It takes the form of a disembodied human foot, many times larger than an ordinary foot. It is often covered in blood or mud and will smash its way into somebody's home and demand that the terrified homeowner wash it. Giant angry foot is coming for you. Oh no, it's so dirty. Clean me. The reason behind this attack was unknown and most likely could never really be understood, as spirits such as the Ashirai Yoshiki were believed to be governed by laws far beyond human understanding. My friend's babysitter had a cousin who was 16. The family had a general store which they ran together. It was in the middle of a street and there were windows that looked right into it. The cousin was having a very tough life. Babysitter didn't want to talk about that, and one day, the cousin took a noose, hung it around a pipe that ran across the shop, and hung himself. His white clothes were stained with blood from where the rope had dug into his neck, and he had an empty black rucksack on that was open. The whole family was shocked. They could not believe he had done it. The grandmother of the family lived in the apartment above the shop and was very ill. She always had to lie in bed next to the window so she could get fresh air. The day after the loss, the family decided that they must go and tell the grandmother what had happened. When they entered her room, she said immediately, "I know why you are here. You have come to tell me that my grandson has killed himself. I know this because after he had done it, I saw him. He walked out onto the street in a white t-shirt and tracksuits. He had looked up at this window and he waved whilst smiling. A black car then pulled up next to him, which he climbed into and drove off. The whole family was terrified. They had no idea what to do or say. In the end, they had the funeral and nothing more was said about it. The grandmother was 80 and was in very bad condition, so whether this story is true, I know not. Nobody had entered her apartment, called her, sent her mail, nothing. Lady of the Lake, White Rock Lake in Dallas, TX, story has been around since the 1930s. One hot July night, a young city couple were driving along the shore of White Rock Lake when they saw a white figure approaching. It was a young girl dressed in a sheer white dress that was dripping wet. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I must find a way home immediately. I was in a boat that overturned. I must get home. She climbed into the rumble seat, saying that she did not wish to get the car too wet, and gave them the address of her home. As they neared the destination, they turned to the rumble seat to ask further directions. The rumble seat was empty, but still wet. The young lady had disappeared. After a brief, futile search for the girl in white, the couple went to the address and were met at the door by a man. When he had heard the couple's story, the man replied, "This is a very strange thing. You are the third couple who has come to me with this story. 3 weeks ago, my daughter was drowned in White Rock Lake. Apparently it's the ghost of a young girl who killed herself in the lake in 1935. And there are still sightings of her apparition on the road that circles the lake. Near the cemetery, of course. I grew up in southern San Diego, in a town called Imperial Beach. There is a local legend there about the Proctor Valley Monster. Here is a copypasta. The stories about the Proctor Valley Monster have been around for many, many years and may even have some tie-in to the legend from the Viejas Indians about the giant hairy man that is the protector of their burial grounds just a couple of miles away. More recently, there were numerous sightings by different individuals during the early 1970s, starting with the winter of 1970-71, just after the largest brush fire in California history, at the time, burned off a large portion of the Sweetwater River area just east of the town of Alpine. That winter was very hard, and local people in the Alpine area started complaining about damage to their houses, fences and losses of chickens and other small farm animals. Since that time, there have been additional sightings of a large hairy biped, about 7 feet tall, accompanied by 2 smaller bipeds, one about 5 feet tall, and the other about 3 feet tall. This area of California is not heavily forested, mostly brush and chaparral, and there are fox and deer in the area, but no one has ever reported a bear sighting. Tracks had been found, and a plaster cast of one such footprint resided in the San Diego County Sheriff's Department for several years, although I cannot say if it is still there or not. The casting was almost 15 inches in length, and about 8 inches wide. Recent reports of a young couple parked out in that area at night never returned home, and when a search party went up there in the morning, they found the car, evidence of a massive struggle and blood. The youngsters were apparently never found.